Hello and welcome to another Marshall Moment. I'm Rob Havers, the president of the George C. Marshall Foundation here in Lexington, Virginia, and today I am delighted to be joined with Daniel Kurtz-Phelan, the author of The China Mission, George C. Marshall's Unfinished War, 1945 to 1947, a truly impressive piece of scholarship and a great addition to the historiography of U.S. foreign policy and also to the historiography and our understanding of who exactly George C. Marshall was. There's a tremendous quotation on the back here from John Lewis Gaddis, who says that this is the best character study of Marshall I have yet seen. He comes alive here as in nothing else that's been written about him, a major achievement. So high praise indeed. Dan, thanks for being with us today. I'd like to start off this Marshall Moment by asking you about George C. Marshall, what you knew about him before you undertook this work, and how your understanding of who he was and what he did changed as a result.
So this book really started for me in the time I was serving in the State Department. As you know, the modern State Department is in many ways a creation of Marshall. That was especially true of the office where I worked, the policy planning staff, which Marshall had created when he was Secretary of State. Marshall looms incredibly large over everything the State Department does. He created really the model of American foreign policy and leadership that we still, in many ways, try to rely on today. In policy planning, there's this constant reference back to the Marshall Plan, especially, and this constant effort to come up with something that is as consequential and transformative as the Marshall Plan. I knew a lot about the Secretary of State period, a lot about his leadership in World War II. What struck me was that the China mission deserved to be its own significant chapter in George Marshall's life. It's a case where Marshall faced what turned out to be an impossible problem and struggled against it for the 13 months of this mission. But my view is you learn as much about him and about how he viewed the world from this failure to solve a problem as you do from his more heroic successes, which are justly famous.
Dan, that provides a very good segue into a line that appears in the book, one of many great lines, but you say in the book that so began a venerable tradition in American politics or statecraft. For every problem, a Marshall Plan is the solution, and we see this on a daily basis. The Marshall Foundation is not exactly inundated, but frequently on the receiving end of requests for more details about a Marshall Plan for the Middle East, a Marshall Plan for public schools in New Jersey. Why do you think this is the case?
Well, it really is. The Marshall Plan really is perhaps the greatest act in American foreign policy in our history. It's certainly one of them. It was almost comical serving in government and the policy planning staff especially, how often both outside commentators, columnists, analysts on the outside, and often our bosses inside government would say, we're contending with this problem in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia or in Central America. Let's just come up for a Marshall Plan for that. They didn't quite register just how much went into the Marshall Plan, how much time Marshall and those who worked for him put into putting it together and persuading the American people that it was worth spending money, nor did they really register that as a percentage of GDP, the Marshall Plan would be equivalent to roughly $1 trillion today. So we were looking at, when I was in government, a time of financial crisis and strapped budgets, and they were asking us to come up with something that would be as transformative without the expenditure. What was really striking to me in going back and tracing this history in the book is that tradition started almost as soon as Marshall gave the speech announcing the Marshall Plan at Harvard in June 1947. He, at that moment, talked about the need to help the Europeans recover from the devastation of the war at a time when the Cold War was beginning. Immediately, there were calls to extend the Marshall Plan to China, to Asia, to Latin America. So it's not just something that we do today. It was happening even in 1947.
Right, very interesting. I think one of the striking things about the book is that you can trace back many of the attitudes to bigger, better-known events in post-war U.S. foreign policy, the commitment and the involvement in Vietnam. You can trace the antecedents in some way back to thinking about what went wrong for Marshall in China. and yet the China mission, until your work, was relatively unstudied, and that's an overstatement in terms of how well studied it really was. What do you think all of that says about how we view the past and the lessons for an understanding of the post-war world that lie in what you looked at in the China mission?
So you raise a point that I have thought about a ton over the last several years. Part of it, I think part of the reason why, certainly for Marshall fans, the China mission tends to get less coverage than some of the better known acts. He did so much in these years.
Right.
There's leadership in World War II, there's his time as Secretary of State, and this slightly discordant 13 months doesn't quite fit into
right.
the myth of Marshall of that period and the myth of American foreign policy of that period. My view is that because we tell the story in a certain way, we tend to get a lot wrong about who Marshall was and how he thought about the world and how he thought about American foreign policy in that period. And I think that myth has led us to get other things wrong going forward, extending the story a bit past the China mission. The question of who lost China became one of the most kind of poisonous and powerful forces in American politics in the 1950s when it was fueling McCarthyism. But really even into the 60s, 70s, and 80s when foreign policymakers would refer back to this moment and the political costs of the perceived loss of China as if it were America's to lose. That drove interventions. It became an argument for intervening in Vietnam, for example, and even into the 1980s, you see some of those forces. So that's why I see a value in correcting that imbalance.
Right. What else have we covered? Okay, one final one, I think. So Daniel, one final question. Did the research and the writing of this book change how you saw George C. Marshall?
So I come away with this. I come away from this project with very high regard for Marshall. One thing that I was really struck by is there's a moment early on in his 13 months in China when things seem to be working. He seems to be succeeding in brokering a peace in the Civil War between the nationalists and the communists. He seems to be succeeding in laying the groundwork for this Chinese democracy that would be allied to the United States. And in that moment, he gets swept up in the kind of fervor for spreading democracy that is still very familiar in American foreign policy. And you see him using baseball references and talking to the Chinese and reading them speeches, Benjamin Franklin speeches. You see this moment when he goes to talk to the director, Frank Capra, about producing a series of instructional videos for the Chinese about how democracy works. And from that moment, he really starts to learn about how much more complex it is. But there is this time early on when his mission seems to be succeeding, when he seems to be achieving what people see as miracles. And he really does get swept up in that in a way that surprised me.
Right, very interesting. Daniel Kurtz-Phelan, thank you so much for your work on this book. And as most of our viewers know, Dan spent a lot of time down here in Lexington doing research in our archives. And you've really helped add another dimension to the Marshall story.
Thank you. Thank you for all you do. The archives are a tremendous resource, and there's a lot more there to be discovered. So
That certainly is indeed.
Yeah.
Dan Kurtz-Phelan, thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us.